A rich man unexpectedly invites a homeless woman to be his date to a lavish ball. Everyone thinks she is dirty and insignificant. But when she shows up at the party, the guests gasp in shock. Julian Marshall stepped out of his sleek black car, the city lights reflecting off its polished surface. As the door closed behind him, it had been another long day. Meetings, negotiations, strategic discussions, all blurring together into the predictable monotony of his life. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit, his mind drifting toward the upcoming charity gala. The annual event was one of the most prestigious gatherings of the city's elite. An evening where fortunes were flaunted, alliances were solidified, and reputations were meticulously maintained. But this year, there was something else weighing on his mind. Elizabeth would be there. His former fiancée. The woman who had walked away from their engagement 6 months ago. She had moved on publicly, gracefully, and, as far as he could tell, happily. She would be attending the gala with her new fiancé. A man Julian had never considered his equal. A name in social circles. A son of old money. But lacking the cunning and drive that Julian had built his empire upon. It shouldn't have bothered him. It shouldn't have mattered. And yet, it did. He had no intention of arriving at the event alone. More than that, he wanted to arrive with someone who would turn heads. Someone who would challenge the expectations placed upon him. He wasn't sure where the idea came from, but as he walked down the dimly lit street, his polished Italian shoes clicking against the damp pavement, his gaze caught something unusual. A woman. Sitting against the cold brick wall of an alley, illuminated by the flickering neon of a nearby sign. She was motionless, her back pressed against the building, legs tucked beneath her to shield herself from the chill of the night air. Unlike others in her position, she wasn't holding out a cup for change. She wasn't muttering at passers-by for help. Instead, she was reading. The book in her hands was worn, its spine cracked from repeated use, the pages curled at the edges. Her fingers, slender despite their grime, held the volume delicately, as though it were the only valuable possession she had left in the world. Julian hesitated. Something unexplainable stopped him from simply walking past as he usually did. There was an air of quiet dignity about her, something that set her apart from the faceless figures that lined the streets in the city's shadows. Her face, though obscured by tangled, unkempt hair, seemed too composed for someone in her situation. No desperation in her expression. No vacant, hollow stare. Instead, there was focus. As if she were deeply engrossed in whatever words were printed on the pages before her. She must have sensed his presence. After a few moments, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes piercing even in the dim light. A shade that seemed to shift between brown and gold as they locked onto his. No immediate recognition of him as a wealthy man. No automatic reaction of fear or flattery. Just a steady, assessing look. The thought came to him suddenly. Irrationally. Yet irresistibly. What if he brought her to the gala? The idea formed in his mind like a challenge. A test of transformation. Could he take a woman from the streets and turn her into the kind of guest who would seamlessly blend into his world? Would it be possible for her to walk into that ballroom and stand alongside the socialites, models, and heiresses without anyone suspecting she didn't belong? It would be a statement. Though he wasn't quite sure to whom. Maybe to Elizabeth. Maybe to himself. He made the offer without fully thinking it through. His own voice catching him off guard as he spoke. She didn't react immediately. Merely tilted her head slightly, as though evaluating his words as she would the text of a novel. When she finally answered, her voice was smooth. Unexpected in its clarity and control. No eagerness in her response. No desperation. Just curiosity. For reasons he couldn't explain, that made him respect her answer even more. She agreed. He wasn't sure what he had expected her to say. Perhaps laughter. Rejection. Or even suspicion. Instead, she stood, closing the book with deliberate care and slipping it under her arm. When she stepped closer, he saw more of her features in the dim light. Beneath the grime and the exhaustion, there was something striking about her. A structure to her cheekbones. An elegance in the curve of her neck. Something that made him certain she had not always lived like this. He opened the car door for her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, she stepped inside. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, he glanced at her reflection in the tinted window. She sat composedly. Her hands folded in her lap. Her gaze fixed ahead rather than darting around in nervousness. He had no idea what he had just set into motion. And neither did she. The quiet hum of the car's engine filled the space between them as they drove through the city. Julian occasionally glanced at his unexpected companion, noting the way she sat with an unusual stillness. She wasn't shifting uncomfortably. Wasn't fidgeting with her hands. Wasn't looking around the luxurious interior of the car with wide-eyed fascination like most people would. She simply existed there beside him. Composed. As if being taken away in a billionaire's car in the middle of the night was just another chapter in her life. When they arrived at his penthouse, he stepped out first and held the door open for her. She hesitated. But only for a moment. The entrance of the building was grand but modern. Designed with subtle opulence. Nothing garish. Just the silent declaration of wealth that came with pristine surfaces, discreet security, and the absence of anything unnecessary. The doorman barely glanced at them as they entered. Accustomed to Julian bringing home beautiful women. What he wasn't used to was someone like her. Julian led her inside without a word, allowing the elevator to glide them to the top floor. The doors opened to reveal the vast space of his penthouse. The walls of glass revealing the sprawl of the city beyond. The skyline glittered with lights, stretching into infinity. But his guest barely looked at it. Instead, she took in the interior. Dark wood floors. Minimalist but expensive furniture. The kind of sleek, curated elegance that spoke of someone who had everything arranged to perfection. He gestured toward the hallway that led to the guest wing. She followed his direction. Her posture steady, despite her exhaustion. He explained that there was a bathroom prepared for her. That she could take as long as she needed. She nodded once and disappeared behind the door. Left alone, Julian exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to do this. It wasn't just about Elizabeth anymore. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. He was beginning to suspect that this was about something else entirely. Though he wasn't ready to define it. He poured himself a drink and leaned against the window. Letting the city stretch beneath him while he waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. He wasn't sure how much time had slipped by before he heard the soft creak of the door opening again. He turned. And the sight before him made him pause. The woman who had entered his home, covered in dirt and wrapped in torn clothing, was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely. She was wearing the robe he had left for her, the thick white fabric loose against her frame, tied at the waist. Her hair, once a tangled mess, was now washed and freed from its knots, cascading down in dark waves. Her skin, now clean, revealed a deep, rich tone that glowed against the soft lighting of the room. She looked different. But what struck him most was the way she carried herself. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't hesitant. She met his gaze with the same level of steadiness she had before. As if nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. Julian set down his drink and crossed the room slowly, observing her more closely. Without the grime, without the weight of the streets upon her, he could see the refined structure of her face. The high cheekbones. The sharp intelligence in her eyes. There was beauty there. Undeniable. Striking. But there was also something else. Strength. She didn't speak first. She simply stood there, waiting. Julian realized in that moment that whatever assumptions he had made about her were likely wrong. She wasn't a woman who had spent her entire life on the streets. She wasn't someone who had simply given up. There was a story here. One that he was suddenly desperate to uncover. The next day, he made arrangements. By noon, they had stepped into one of the city's most exclusive boutiques. A place where stylists whispered in hushed tones. Where fabrics draped over mannequins in careful displays of effortless elegance. She walked through the space with a presence that didn't quite match the way she had looked the night before. As if she belonged here. But hadn't been here in a very long time. A team of assistants swarmed around her, bringing her dresses, adjusting the fit, suggesting accessories. Julian watched from a distance. As they transformed her into something the world would accept as one of their own. The emerald green gown they eventually settled on fit her like it had been made for her. Clinging in the right places. Flowing in the others. Her transformation was not just in appearance. It was in the way she stood. In the way she regarded herself in the mirror. A quiet recognition in her eyes. He knew then that she wasn't seeing herself as someone new. She was remembering who she used to be. The next stop was the salon. Her nails were shaped and polished. Her hair styled with the careful attention of expert hands. The process was long. Meticulous. But at the end of it, when she stepped in front of the mirror, she didn't just look beautiful. She looked like someone who had never fallen from grace to begin with. That evening, she stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over the city with a glass of wine in her hand. Julian stepped outside to join her, leaning on the railing beside her. The night air was cool. The lights below pulsed with life. He asked her then who she was before. She took a long sip of her wine before answering. She had been a woman of power once. A name in the financial world. An executive with influence. With a future that had seemed limitless. She had built a company from the ground up. Had made investments that turned millions into billions. She had been respected. Sought after. And then it had all come crashing down. She spoke of betrayal. Of rivals who had not accepted her success. Of how, as a black woman in a world dominated by men who looked nothing like her, she had always known that she had to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good. When the accusations came, they came quickly. Whispers of fraud. Of unethical business practices. They froze her assets. Revoked her partnerships. Dragged her name through the mud until no one would touch her. It hadn't mattered that the claims were false. What mattered was that the world believed them. She had lost everything. And the people who had once praised her had let it happen without hesitation. Julian listened in silence. He could feel the weight of every word. The injustice of it all settling in his chest like lead. She wasn't just someone who had ended up on the streets. She had been put there deliberately. And yet, she had survived. She looked at him then. And in her eyes, he saw no plea for sympathy. No trace of victimhood. Only resolve. And for the first time in a very long time, Julian Marshall felt something shift inside him. This had started as a game. A simple challenge of turning a woman from the streets into someone fit for his world. But now he realized it was something much more than that. And he was no longer sure if he was the one in control. The evening of the gala arrived. The ballroom at the Four Seasons was a masterpiece of opulence. Bathed in the glow of chandeliers that sparkled like frozen stars. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume. The murmur of conversation blending seamlessly with the soft strains of a live string quartet. Everywhere, men in tailored tuxedos and women in gowns worth small fortunes moved through the space. Glasses of champagne held delicately in manicured fingers. Each person keenly aware of their place in this carefully curated ecosystem of wealth and power. Julian Marshall walked through the entrance. His dark suit perfectly fitted. His presence commanding. But it was not him who drew the attention of the crowd. It was the woman at his side. Naomi stepped into the ballroom as if she had never left it. The emerald green gown, tailored to perfection, shimmered under the golden light. Her hair, styled in elegant waves, framed a face that held not just beauty, but presence. There was something in her bearing. An effortless grace. A confidence that did not seek validation, but rather expected it. That made her seem not like a guest at this event, but a queen returning to her court. The moment they crossed the threshold, conversations faltered. Eyes widened. Expressions shifted from curiosity to something more complex. Recognition flickered in some gazes, uncertainty in others. The name Naomi had once carried weight in these circles, but her absence had been long enough that people hesitated, uncertain if what they were seeing was real. Elizabeth was among the first to notice. She stood near the center of the room, her red gown a deliberate contrast to the delicate champagne hues worn by most of the other women. Her arm was draped over the one belonging to her fiancé, a man whose presence had once felt like a challenge to Julian, but now barely registered. Her expression remained carefully composed, but there was something in her eyes, something sharp and assessing as she took in Naomi at Julian's side. Julian greeted Elizabeth with the smooth politeness of a man who had nothing to prove. He introduced Naomi without hesitation, his voice steady, his demeanor unreadable. Elizabeth extended a hand in greeting, her smile polite but strained. And Naomi, without missing a beat, accepted it, with the poise of a queen. The tension between them was subtle but unmistakable. Naomi had no need for the kind of passive aggression that fueled interactions at these events. She did not seek approval, nor did she shrink from the scrutiny of the woman who had once been the center of Julian's life. Instead, she met Elizabeth's gaze with something far more unsettling: indifference. It was not Elizabeth who posed the real challenge that evening. That honor belonged to the men who had orchestrated Naomi's downfall. Julian had suspected they would be here. The city's financial elite gathered in the same circles. Their power solidified not just through wealth, but through mutual benefit and unspoken agreements. The men who had once considered Naomi a competitor, the ones who had whispered fabricated accusations into the right ears and ensured her exile, were among the guests, holding court in small clusters where influence was exchanged like currency. The first to recognize her was Richard Caldwell, a venture capitalist whose empire had expanded in the years since Naomi had disappeared. His eyes locked onto her across the room, his expression shifting from casual amusement to something far sharper. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but had lost the ability to form words. It took only moments for others to follow his gaze. Faces that had once turned away from Naomi in silence now watched her with a mixture of disbelief and thinly veiled concern. She was supposed to be gone. She was supposed to be irrelevant. And yet, here she stood, unbowed, more radiant than ever. A woman who had not been erased, but reborn. Julian watched as she navigated the room with the precision of a seasoned player. Her every step measured, every interaction deliberate. She did not seek confrontation, did not throw accusations into the air. Instead, she simply existed among them. Her presence, a silent but undeniable challenge. Caldwell finally approached, his voice smooth, but his eyes betraying the calculation behind them. He greeted Julian first, his tone unfriendly, but his gaze lingered on Naomi, a flicker of something like nervousness crossing his features. He asked her where she had been, his words casual, but the weight behind them unmistakable. Naomi smiled, slow, knowing. She told him, in a voice calm and controlled, that life had taken her on an unexpected detour, but that she had always planned to return. The words were simple, but their meaning was clear. She was not a ghost of the past. She was the future they had tried to bury. The night unfolded like a slow-burning revelation. Naomi did not need to shout to be heard. She let the weight of her presence do the speaking. And it was more powerful than any accusation could have been. The men who had once stood at the top of the industry, who had thrived in her absence, now saw the storm they had tried to outrun approaching once more. Julian, standing by her side, understood now why he had been drawn to her that night on the street. She was not simply a woman who had lost everything. She was a force that had been unjustly taken down. And now, she was rising again. By the end of the evening, whispers spread through the ballroom like wildfire. Who was she? Where had she been? What did her return mean? Elizabeth, watching from a distance, finally seemed to understand something too. She had once thought Julian was a man who measured his worth by the women at his side. But as she watched him with Naomi, saw the way his focus never wavered, the way he looked at her not as an accessory, but as something much more, she realized the truth. Julian had changed. And Naomi had never been just a statement. She had been a choice. As the gala wound to a close, and the city pulsed with life outside the grand ballroom, Julian escorted Naomi toward the exit. The cameras flashed as they stepped into the cool night air, the questions from reporters already beginning. But Julian ignored them, his gaze shifting toward the woman beside him. Naomi did not look back at the ballroom. She had no need to. Her past was no longer something to escape. It was something she was preparing to reclaim. The echoes of the gala followed Julian and Naomi long after they left. The city's elite had spent the night murmuring about her return, speculating on what it meant, whispering behind the rims of their champagne glasses. But none of them understood. None of them knew the full extent of what had been stolen from her, or the weight of the injustice that had left her stranded on the streets. Julian had always believed himself to be a man who understood power, who wielded it effortlessly. But Naomi's story had opened his eyes to a reality he had never truly faced. The world he moved through so easily, the one that had rewarded him for his cunning and ambition, had crushed her without hesitation. The moment she became inconvenient. She had once been one of them. Brilliant, resourceful, respected. But when powerful men had decided she no longer belonged, they had erased her, as if she had never existed. Sitting across from her in the quiet of his penthouse, Julian watched as she traced her fingers along the rim of her glass. Deep in thought. He had spent years closing multi-million-dollar deals, reading the faces of his competitors and allies alike. But he had never met anyone like her. Naomi didn't just carry herself like someone who had survived. She carried herself like someone who had once commanded the world, and was planning to take it back. She told him everything. Not just the broad strokes she had given him before, but the details. The names. The meetings. The fabricated evidence that had led to her downfall. She had been at the height of her career. A woman who had built her company from the ground up, navigating a world that had never been designed for someone like her. She had outmaneuvered rivals, secured investments others had thought impossible, and turned her firm into a force to be reckoned with. And then came the whispers. The meetings she hadn't been invited to. The allies who had suddenly grown distant. The audits. The allegations. The strategically placed headlines in business publications, hinting at financial misconduct. By the time the accusations became formal, the damage had already been done. Clients withdrew their contracts. Partners distanced themselves. Investors pulled out. The final blow had come from Robert Sinclair. He had been more than just a mentor. He had been a supporter, an ally. She had trusted him. And in the end, he had been the one to ensure she couldn't recover. He had stood by as her company was dismantled. as the board members she had once worked alongside voted to remove her, as her accounts were frozen, and legal teams ensured she would never be able to build anything again. Julian felt something dark settle in his chest as he listened. He had met Sinclair before, had shaken his hand, had sat across from him at negotiations. He had always known the man was ruthless, but he had never seen this side of him. Sinclair wasn't just a businessman playing a hard game. He was a man who had deliberately destroyed someone's life to maintain his own dominance. Naomi wasn't asking for pity. She wasn't asking for help. But Julian had already made his decision. The next morning, he made the first call. The next morning, he made the first call. He had built his empire on knowing things before others did. He had contacts in law firms, in media, in financial institutions. If there was a paper trail, he would find it. If there was a weakness in the foundation of Sinclair's power, he would expose it. Naomi didn't hesitate when he told her what he planned to do. If anything, she looked at him with something close to amusement, as if she had expected no less. She didn't need a savior. She needed an ally. Days passed in a whirlwind of movement. Julian's team worked behind the scenes, pulling records, finding the discrepancies buried in legal jargon and sealed contracts. The deeper they dug, the clearer the picture became. Sinclair and his associates hadn't just removed Naomi. They had used her as a scapegoat to cover their own financial crimes. The fraud they had accused her of had been real, but it hadn't been hers. When the first anonymous leak hit the press, it sent shockwaves through the industry. Articles began to appear in financial journals, questioning old reports, highlighting inconsistencies in the narrative that had condemned Naomi years ago. Investors started asking questions. Legal teams prepared statements. Sinclair dismissed the rumors at first, calling them baseless. But Julian knew the game well enough to recognize a man losing control of his own narrative. The breaking point came when Naomi decided to make her first public statement. It wasn't through a press conference or a formal interview. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated moment. An appearance at a financial summit, where Sinclair himself was expected to speak. Julian watched from the sidelines as she entered the conference hall. Her presence, impossible to ignore. She didn't wait for an invitation to speak. She simply stood, letting the murmurs settle before she addressed the room. She told the truth. She named names. She didn't shout, didn't accuse with anger. She didn't need to. The weight of her words was enough. She laid out the facts, the documents, the undeniable proof of what had been done to her. She didn't ask for justice. She demanded it. By the time she finished, the room was silent. And Sinclair, for the first time in his career, looked shaken. The fallout was immediate. Investigations were reopened. Legal teams scrambled. Board members who had once distanced themselves from Naomi suddenly found themselves forced to answer for their involvement. And Julian? He watched it all unfold with a sense of satisfaction he hadn't expected. But it wasn't just about bringing down the men who had ruined Naomi's life. It was about what came next. In the weeks that followed, Naomi was offered opportunities to return to the industry, to rebuild, to reclaim her place. But she was no longer interested in playing by their rules. She had spent too many years watching the system work against people like her. Now, she wanted to create something of her own. Julian had his own offer for her. Not as a business proposition. Not as a calculated move. He wanted her to stay. He had spent years building his life around control, around winning. But with Naomi, it wasn't about control. It wasn't about power. It was about choice. And he wanted her to choose him. For the first time in a long time, Naomi had the power to decide her own future. And she chose him. As they stood together on the balcony of his penthouse, the city stretching beneath them, there were no contracts, no negotiations, no carefully constructed plans. Just the quiet understanding between two people who had fought their way back to the top. Naomi wasn't just reclaiming her life. She was building something new. And for the first time, so was he.